Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode. I'm the Patchwork Commander and today we're going to do an entire set review in under 10 minutes because most of the time it's just tough sitting through all these spoiler videos that are so long. So I'm going to talk about some of the best flicker targets we've ever seen, some of the best enchantment spells we've ever seen for Commander. But before we get into that, I'm the Patchwork Commander and I make weekly videos every single Friday. So please, if you could just hit that subscribe button, helps me out a ton. And let's get right into the set review. When going over the set review, we definitely have to go over all the blink targets because these evoke cards that are in the set are the best blink targets I've ever seen before. For example, Grief. All we have to do is exile a black card from our hand and we get to cast this card for its evoke cost, which means it enters the battlefield and it gets sacrificed right away, which means our enter the battlefield effects still trigger. And this says it reveals target opponent's hands and we get to make them discard a card from it. Now this is great in a Turgid style deck because we get to steal the best card from our opponent's hand by just making them discard it. And black has a great way of says when this creature dies, return it back to the battlefield, and evoke makes us sacrifice the creature right away. Another example of this is Solitude, exiling a white card, and we get to get a sweet Swords to Plowshares for free, and that's completely great, but it's in white, so it comes with cards like Ephemerate. Ephemerate make us blink the card, and since it's a new target, now we no longer need to sacrifice that creature, and with Ephemerate, it has Rebound, so we get this ability again. Another example of this is Foundation Breaker, costing only 2 mana to evoke, but 4 mana total. But since it only costs 2 to evoke, if we have an instant speed way to blink it, all of a sudden, these effects that normally cost 3 mana is just 2 mana, and we get to keep this body forever. Now, the other reason that I really want to go over the set really quickly is because we have some of the best white cards ever. And it all starts off with Esper Sentinel. Now, this says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, if they don't pay X, where X is this creature's power, then they have to let us draw a card. So let's say they don't pay 1 for paying a non-creature spell, all of a sudden we get to draw a card. Now think of this, artifacts, instant speeds like Ops, a lot of cantrips in Commander nowadays, and also Farseek, ramp cards are all non-creature spells, and every single time our opponents are going to have to pay 1. Now this is great for us either way. Either we slow our opponents down by a single turn, which is huge nowadays as tempo is the most important thing in Commander, or we just get to draw a bunch of cards. And for 1 mana, I think this just goes about any deck that has white in it. Now another card that sees this white power boost is Nykthos Paragon, gaining us X 1/1 counters where X is the amount of life we've gained once per turn. So just if we have a lifelink creature, for example an Atraxa deck, we can attack for 4 and we gain 4 life based off of the lifelink whenever we deal combat damage. So all of a sudden we get 4 1/1 counters on creatures. Now imagine this in a Tristani deck, or any type of white deck. These decks gain a bunch of life in a singular turn, and all of a sudden can turn all that life into one huge creature. And I just like this effect because all of a sudden, every white creature has become a threat on the battlefield. For example, if we can put all those 1/1 counters on an Esper Sentinel, imagine what it can do, because all of a sudden our opponents are going to have to pay so much for their taxes. And only costing 2 mana to spend, Resurgent Belief has got to be one of the white cards that really powers up the mono white color and also enchantment decks in general, because when it gets off suspend, we can all of a sudden return all of our enchantments back onto the battlefield. Now waiting 2 turns in an enchantment deck isn't really that big of a deal because our decks are very slow and very grimy. We have a lot of rule of law type effects that slow down the pace of our game, so that means we only have to wait 2 turns to return all artifacts and enchantments for only 2 mana invested. That means we can do other stuff on the same turn we play Resurgent Belief. Now most of the time this costs 4 mana or more to return all enchantments onto the battlefield. And the next card slots into every enchantment style deck, and that's no joke, and that's Synthis Harvest Hand. Now this costs only 2 mana, a green and a white. It's a 1/2, and it says whenever we cast an enchantment, we get to draw a card and gain 1 life. So this card simply takes out any other Enchantress. Enchantress are all cards that says whenever we cast an enchantment, draw a card, and most of these cost 3 mana. So for the simple fact that it costs 1 mana less, it just goes into all those decks. But not to mention that this has got to be the best enchantment commander ever built, because most enchantment commanders have huge restrictions. For example, can only draw 1 card per turn. And this doesn't have any restrictions whatsoever, so this makes it by far the best enchantment card we've ever seen in Commander. And the next card is perfect for an enchantment deck, and that's Sanctum Weaver. Normally this card would cost $200 because it's built in on a land that's in the reserve list, of course, and it only costs 2 mana for us, but we get to tap it to add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of enchantment we control. So the simple fact that we get to add so much mana in an enchantment deck, and it's so important that we do, because enchantment decks are really slow, and they build up over time. But this card can ramp those decks up to 10, and finally speed up those decks where they can compete with normal decks. This next category is focused specifically on retooled cards. Cards that we've seen before, but they're now in different bodies. A great example of this is Dam, costing only 2 mana, a black and a black, and we can destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated, or we can pay its overload cost, costing 2 and a white. This basically means it's a better Wrath of God because it has the flexibility of just being a kill spell, so I think it goes great in any 4+ color deck, just because it's another version of Wrath of God. Another example of this is Ignoble Hierarch, costing only 1 mana, taps for any of the Mardu colors, and it has Exalted. So it's a great example of just being another Noble Hierarch. And we have so little versions of 1 mana ramp in Commander nowadays, so this is going to go into any 5-color deck, and it's going straight into my Joda deck. Another example of that is Harmonic Prodigy, costing a red and a colorless. This says whenever an ability of either a wizard or a shaman triggers, it triggers an additional time. We've seen this effect already with Nabam before, but just having another version for Nala decks, and there's so many wizard decks in general that definitely slot into those decks. The next card that we've seen before is like Lotus Cobra. It's called Tireless Prodigy, costing only 3 mana, 2 colorless, and 1 green, and it says whenever a land enters the battlefield, we can either create a food or we can create a treasure token. Now this is better because with Lotus Cobra, you always had to spend the mana right away. With this card, you don't have to. All you have to do is just play a land and you get a treasure. And you can use it later on in the game, something that you don't have the flexibility with Lotus Cobra. And is perfect for any landfall deck and green deck in general. And another great example of a retooled card is Persist, costing 1 and a black, and it says we can return target non-legendary card from our graveyard back onto the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. Now, I think this is just a new version of Animate Dead, but for non-legendary cards. And the reason I think this card is so good is because we have a card like Archon of Cruelty, the next best Reanimator card we've ever seen, and Persist and Archon of Cruelty should go into those decks. And Archon of Cruelty is a 6/6 flyer. It says when it enters the battlefield, target opponent needs to either sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, they have to discard a card, they lose 3 life, we gain 3 life, and draw a card. Now this happens whenever it attacks or enters the battlefield. So we're going to get so many uses out of this card, out of a Reanimator deck, and having Persist, another way to do it, is the perfect card for any of these decks. And as far as new cards go, Dauthi Voidwalker is the newest reason why Black doesn't have an excuse to play Graveyard Hate. Basically being unblockable for 2 mana, this says whenever a card hits an opponent's graveyard, exile it instead, and then we can tap and sacrifice it to cast a card from exile. And this is great in any black deck or rogues deck. And another card that's great in any artifact deck is Urza's Saga, basically being at the 3rd step, able to grab a Soul Ring for free, but also great to grab Skull Clamp in token decks and in Aristocrat decks, something that my friend pointed out to me. And the newest card that I think is the coolest commander is Chatterfang Squirrel General. Whenever we create a token, we play that many tokens, and we create X squirrels in addition, basically being the new doubling season, but instead of doubling our tokens, we just get that many squirrels as well. And a new card that's amazing is Artifact Manufacturer. Whenever we create either a treasure, we create a clue, or we create a food token, we create all 3. Basically turning a food token into ramp and card draw, or any of the 3 into ramp and card draw as well as an incidental way of gaining life. And if you really didn't believe me that this is the best Blink set ever, Sword of Hearth and Home has something to say, because it says whenever equipped creature deals combat damage, we get to blink a creature, and we get to search our library for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped. Now this is not only giving us relevant protection, but also +2/+2, so I think it just replaces Sword of the Animus, because so many decks have creatures with Enter the Battlefields nowadays. And the most unique Planeswalker has to go to Grist the Huntertide. I think this will find a great home in Marin style decks, because you can tutor it from your library and put it directly into play, and I think it's going to be a great sacrifice outlet as well. And as far as the most unique Simic commander we've ever seen is Lonis the Cryptozoologist, a good card in general, because whenever a creature enters the battlefield, we get to create a clue. Again, if we flicker creatures, we get to make more and more clues, which we can turn into card draw, or we can tap and sacrifice X clues and look at the top X cards of an opponent's library, and we can cast a card with converted mana cost X and play it for absolutely free. And that's the best of the new cards. And these next cards I'm going to go over very quickly is Goblin and Archomancer, costing a green and a red, making green-red spells cost 1 less mana. I think this is good in a 2 to 3 color deck. Just by making all of your spells cost 1 less, you can have so many explosive turns. There's a reason why all the medallions cost like $12 nowadays. Another great card is Chance Encounter. This is probably the most fun card of the set, costing 2 and 2 red, and it says if we win 10 coin flips, we win the game. Great for any Crick deck. And then another card that's great is Ornithopter of Paradise, costing 2 mana, tapping for any color of mana. This, I think, is good just because we do not have that many artifacts that tap for any color of mana. So this is another one to add to those decks. And the last card that I'm going to go over really quickly is Brea's Apprentice, costing 2 and a red. When it enters the battlefield, it creates a 1/1 Flying Thopter, and we can tap it to either sacrifice to give our creature +2/+0, or exile the top card of our library. This goes great in any Brea style deck or artifact deck with red, like for example Duretti, to give us card advantage, which most of those decks don't really have. And those are all the cards that I think are the best for Commander, and that was a huge mouthful. So please, if you really like this, hit that subscribe button just one more time, and thank you so much for watching. I'm the Patchwork Commander, and have a great weekend.